Hello and welcome to a third episode of Spotlight MAME. In this episode I want to look at something that's become a staple of MAME development over the last year or so, and that is the Game & Watch emulation. Most of this work recently has been done by Algestam from Sweden, and he's been dumping the devices, and he has a Twitter which I'll bring up here where you can see some of the work. Here is the inside one of the Game & Watch units. In this case it's the gold version of Manhole, which I'll be covering shortly. Here is him scanning some of the LCDs. This one is Fire, which was added previously. This one is I believe Mario Brothers. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting content on his Twitter if you want to have a look at that. I'll put a link below. But anyway, let's fire up Manhole in MAME, and actually I'm going to start by firing up both versions because there are two distinct versions of this game. First off, we have the gold version, which is the recently dumped one, and that was from 1981. But there was also the new widescreen version from 1983, which has been emulated for a little bit longer. As you can see, they look quite different on the outside. This is with the full artwork from hydef. I'll show you what it looks like without the artwork shortly. But the previously emulated version, which was the new widescreen version, you can see there are quite a lot more segments to the graphics across the wall here. And this does impact how they play, actually. So we'll look at that shortly, and obviously the arrangement of the HUD area here has changed a little bit too. But let's close these down and just fire up the gold version for now. Here we go, and have a look at how this plays, because this is one of those classic Nintendo Game & Watch games, and very simple gameplay. See, this is the demo. I can't control it yet. Let's start game A. This is one of the early classic ones, so the gameplay is quite simple. And if you think about it, it's not that different to the older game Fire. You're positioning your character in a way to stop somebody else from falling. Here there's a slight difference because the screen is divided into the upper and bottom parts, and you can move freely into any position. And it's not guaranteed that a guy who leaves on the bottom will appear on the top, although early on it's pretty much a one-to-one thing. But, the game starts out quite slow, like all of these Game & Watches, and you can get a feel for it. We'll play for a little bit. Now we've already got two men. I'd consider these units to be an important part of our history, because back in sort of 1981 when they were released, or the first one, which was released in 1980, these were the only real options you had for handheld gaming. And these days we are increasingly playing games on mobile devices, and so you have to look at this as really where that came from. If you note here, as soon as I lose a life, there's a brief pause, and then the game continues from exactly where it left off. That will be significant later when we have a look at the new widescreen version. You have to get there right before they fall in the water. Now, I failed here. I've got my 3 misses, but on many of these early units, you could still move around even when you're not playing. That is, I guess, to save space on the programming, because there was a very limited ROM capacity on these. Game B on instead. I think this starts off slightly more difficult, like the guy starts at the top there. But yeah, for a long time, people were saying that these things were entirely logic. There was no CPU inside them, which we found out to be false, because every single one of the Game & Watch games runs off a Sharp MCU, with different ones over the different iterations of the series. So the early ones have a lower capacity and can drive less segments. The later ones can drive more, which is probably why the newer widescreen version of Manhole, which we'll look at in a bit, has more segments. It's based on newer tech. This plays pretty much the same. If I was to miss the man again, would act just like the other one. Yeah, slight pause, and then it just resumes. And let's miss that guy. And this guy will shortly continue. But yeah, it's one of the classic games, really, and it's one of the things that makes me really happy that MAME did start taking into consideration non-arcade stuff, because until this point there wasn't much good information about this type of thing, and MAME has become really a beacon for preservation, and lots of people getting involved with preserving this type of thing, emulating it and documenting what's inside, which is really good, because I don't see where else that was going to happen if I hadn't taken the initiative and tried to get everybody together. And yeah, that's one of the things with this type of work. I mentioned Algestam, but there's also hydef, who's done the artwork, I said, but we've got Mr. Do, who's provided some of the units for dumping. We've got Sean Riddle, who worked out some of the techniques early on. We've got Moog, the guy who's put some of his money towards it and found people to contribute. So at this point, we've got the majority of the Game & Watch units emulated, which is really good going, considering just a handful of years ago, reputable sources seem to think these were just logic-based, no CPU, but that's all been shown to be incorrect, and we've been able to emulate them, which I'm really happy about. Anyway, that was the gold version. Let's quickly have a look at the other version, which is the new widescreen version, which was from '83. See, this one's Sharp SM510, which is a newer version. But here we go. Right, so as you say, you can see there are more segments, and that will come into play. But let's just start this up and put this in game mode A. You can also hear the sounds a bit different on this unit. But the gameplay is basically the same. But since this was one of the popular early games, Nintendo did feel it fit to re-release it, and some things were changed. You'll see that shortly. Just going to get up to a few more guys running across at the moment. Here we go. So I'm going to miss this guy. Now, you'll notice this extra animation here as he dries off his clothes after falling in the water. And then the positions of everybody resets. It doesn't just continue from where it left off like with the gold version. So that does change how it plays a little bit. I guess this was an intentional change based on probably feedback from the original game. Oh. And the thing to note as well is these are entirely different pieces of code. If you look at the game in the disassembly, you'll see there's very little in common between the two versions. So it was rewritten. So it's this new widescreen version, which has been emulated for a while now, is more of a sequel than really a re-release. Though it was just sold as the same thing, but in a new case, and obviously you can see that the way the new unit looks. That was game A on that one. This is just a quick demonstration. You can get maybe 7-8 men on the screen at once if you play for long enough. I don't know the limit, but it gets quite high and very challenging. Yeah, I've seen on Algestam's page that he's just done the Mario the Juggler game actually, but I'll have to cover that in a future episode. I've not got that one all set up at the moment. That's an interesting one too, because it mirrors the original release of the original Game & Watch game from 1980, but with a Mario theme. You can see just how nice these are looking too with all the artwork. One thing I'll come to in a bit is that outside of later ports to the Game Boy and the like, Nintendo didn't really license these out for home systems, which surprises me because I think the 8-bit computers of the era could have done a really good job of some kind of collection of ports of these things, but maybe there wasn't the market for it. I don't know. Only today these are getting really expensive to buy and considered classics. Back in the day, they were what you carried around a school playground, really. I remember before the Game Boy came out, and even for quite a few years after that, everybody had one of these, the official ones or some of the clones that sometimes clone the games exactly, or just had their own different original games. Thing is, the batteries lasted for ages. They were quite difficult to damage, and they were relatively cheap. You didn't have the expensive cartridges you had for the Game Boy, where one game would set you back a fair bit. So they've remained popular for quite a while. Anyway, I talked a bit about hydef and the artwork, and this is obviously what they look like with all the artwork on. But if you take a look at what they look like with just the scanned graphics, the SVGs, they look more like this. So you lose all your backgrounds, you lose the case and everything else, which it doesn't look as good. So his work has really impressed me too, because it's made all the difference in these just being very primitive looking to actually feeling like the real thing. I was talking about the ports, or lack of ports, really. And while these didn't get ports, two games always come to mind when I think of these Game & Watch games, especially Manhole. And one of them is this little title. It's on the Amstrad CPC. The Amstrad CPC emulation isn't the best in MAME, but it does for this demonstration. No. The G isn't working. That's better. Yeah, I think I need to unstick my G key. What's up with it? This is Bridget, which a lot of Amstrad owners will tell you isn't a great game, but serves for the purpose of what I'm trying to demonstrate here. Jump straight in, but you've got 4 bridges. You've got a bunch of guys trying to get from one end to the other, and this was released in 1983, so the same year as the new widescreen version of Manhole, and several years, well, 2 years after the original gold release. It's probably trickier than Manhole. You've got more going on. And it's got smoother animation. Because it's not the best program, the music's slowing down already with very little happening. And the graphics, they're not great, but this actually did convince me that I wanted an Amstrad, because having a Spectrum at the time and seeing this, even though it's a primitive game, with many more colours on screen and no colour clash, still managed to be impressive. And if you get into it, it's not as bad as some reviews might make out. It's just a very simple game. And if you're expecting something that plays like a Game & Watch title, then it delivers on that front. But maybe the poor reception of this with a lot of people is one reason we didn't see more games that were similar to Game & Watch games on the 8-bits. But we did see some. So I'm going to take a look at another one shortly on the Spectrum this time, in fact. So here we go. Let's get the Spectrum up. This one is actually quite different. Right. Put it quickly. Right, the audio is annoying, but you can turn it off, thankfully. This is the Train game by Microsphere. I believe it's also 1983 release for the 16K Spectrum. And if I'm going to call the genre of these games Overseer, helpful Overseer type things, this still fits the description. You've got all these trains moving around, you've got all these points on the screen, and you have to guide the train to different stations to pick up the people. You also have to press which colour train you want to stop. And, I forgot to change the points there, so I crashed. This is like not putting the manhole where the person is walking. Get another chance though. And if you switch the points on another train, that happens. It's on this level, it's actually quite an easy title. But like all these games, got to stop the train. It gets much more difficult if I put it on a higher difficulty, which I will do shortly. If you go off the screen there, you'll come back on the screen a bit below. And that's how we get to that station. And train again. Okay. I think we get another chance. That's that difficulty level. Now I said this gets quite chaotic, but so if I was to set that difficulty level 7, so you've got lots of trains all heading around. There's so much to keep track of. I think you've got your 3 normal trains which can stop, and then you've got the other trains which you have to direct back off the screen from where they came, the black ones, and that makes it very tricky to play. But anyway, one of the other reasons I find this to be like a Game & Watch game is because the Game & Watch games all contained Game A and Game B, and what you have here with this is very similar. If you go, where's it take? There's a side B on the cassette, and if we load that one up, you'll see, much like the Game & Watch games, side B is the same game but more difficult. This has got a more complex layout. This might just be because on the 16K Spectrum, games quite often got divided up into multiple parts because the memory wasn't there to load it. But to me, it's almost saying that there was an influence from the Game & Watch games. I don't know if there was. I don't even know who programmed this. The World of Spectrum and the other site, Spectrum Computing, just seem to credit Microsphere. So it is one of those classics, though. It's a very tough game to play, get your head around. But yeah, from playing Game & Watch things at school, to coming home, this one is one that always made me think, this is similar. But, yeah, I'll close that now anyway. Anyway, thank you for listening to this. I think I'm going to say that's all for now. If you want to look at the Manhole, they're in the MAME 0.215 releases that were last week. If you want to run the Spectrum and CPC games, the Spectrum game is in the software list, which I've been adding stuff to recently, as is the CPC game. So you can give those a spin. But yeah, thank you. And if you like this content, please hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.